For 5 years, my mother told everyone in our extended family that I was a waitress and, in her words, the disappointment of the family. At her 60th birthday party, she introduced me to a table of relatives as the one who didn't finish college. I smiled, said nothing, and handed her a business card. She looked at the card, looked at me, and the wine glass in her hand slipped straight out of her fingers. My name is Faith Halloway. I'm 34. Before I explain what was actually printed on that card, let me take you back to when I was 19, because none of what happened at that birthday party makes sense without understanding exactly why I left college in the first place, and exactly what my mother chose to believe about that decision instead of ever asking me directly. If you're the kind of person who watches a story through to the end, go ahead and subscribe, only if you genuinely mean it. Drop your city and local time in the comments, I read every one. I grew up in Carbondale, Illinois, the oldest of 3 children. My father, Russell, worked as a machinist at a manufacturing plant that had, for most of my childhood, provided a stable if modest income. My mother, Deborah, managed our household and, later, worked part-time at a fabric store once all 3 of us were old enough for school. I'd been accepted, at 18, into a solid-state university 2 hours from home, majoring in accounting, with a partial academic scholarship covering roughly a third of the cost. My parents had been, understandably, proud, the first of their children to attend a 4-year university, a milestone they'd talked about at every family gathering that first semester with obvious pride. 16 months into my sophomore year, everything about our family's stability collapsed within the span of about 6 weeks. My father's plant announced sudden layoffs, eliminating his position along with nearly 200 others, the result of a corporate restructuring nobody had seen coming. 3 weeks later, my youngest brother, Miles, then 11, was diagnosed with a serious autoimmune condition requiring specialized treatment not fully covered by my parents' suddenly precarious insurance situation. My mother called me on a Tuesday evening in October, her voice carrying a controlled panic I'd never heard from her before, explaining the full scope of what was happening: my father's unemployment, Miles's mounting medical bills, my other brother Desmond's tuition at the local community college, a mortgage payment that suddenly felt impossible to sustain without my father's income. She didn't ask me directly to leave school. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to how everything unfolded afterward. What she did instead was lay out the situation in exhausting, overwhelming detail, describing options that all seemed to circle back to one obvious solution neither of us said out loud during that call. I withdrew from the university 2 weeks later, at 19, and moved back to Carbondale. I found work immediately at a diner near the highway, the only job I could get quickly enough to start contributing to household expenses within days rather than weeks. Within 4 months, I was promoted to shift supervisor. Within a year, the diner's owner, a woman named Sylvie who'd taken a genuine interest in my work ethic, offered to help me pursue a hospitality management certification through a local community college program, night classes I could manage around my full shifts. I never told my mother the actual math I did that October, that I'd calculated, quietly, exactly how many months of diner wages would keep Miles's treatment funded, exactly how much of my own scholarship money I'd need to formally return, exactly what returning to school later, once things stabilized, might realistically look like versus what my mother's panic was implying needed to happen immediately. What my mother told the rest of the family, in the months and then years that followed, was a considerably simpler story: that I'd dropped out of college because I couldn't handle the workload, that I'd given up on the opportunity they'd worked so hard to provide, that I was now just waitressing, while my siblings, eventually, both went on to complete their own degrees once the family's financial situation stabilized. I didn't correct that story initially, partly out of exhaustion, and partly, I think, out of a kind of protective instinct toward my mother. Some part of me understood that admitting the actual truth, that I'd left school specifically to help fund Miles's treatment and keep our household afloat during my father's unemployment, would have required her to sit with a guilt she seemed determined not to examine. By the time Miles's health stabilized and my father found new employment 18 months later, the family narrative about my college departure had already calcified into something nobody seemed interested in revisiting. I'd become, in my mother's retelling at every subsequent family gathering, the one who didn't finish, a phrase she used with a specific, dismissive lightness that made clear she'd never once considered there might be more to the story. I stayed in the restaurant industry after that, initially out of practical necessity, but increasingly, over the following years, out of genuine passion I hadn't expected to discover. I completed that hospitality certification, then pursued additional coursework in restaurant finance and operations, slowly building expertise that had nothing to do with the waitress label my mother continued applying to me at every opportunity. By 26, I'd moved from Sylvie's Diner into a management position at a growing regional restaurant group. By 29, I'd been recruited into a director of operations role. By 32, following a private investment round I'd helped structure with two former colleagues, I co-founded my own hospitality consulting firm, specializing in operational turnarounds for struggling independent restaurants, a business that, within its first 18 months, had already worked with over a dozen clients across 3 states. None of this ever fully registered with my mother, despite my occasional, increasingly rare attempts to mention it during family conversations. She'd absorbed the story of 19-year-old Faith who gave up on college, so completely that no amount of subsequent professional development seemed capable of updating it in her mind. Her 60th birthday party, held at a rented event space in downtown Carbondale, brought together nearly 60 guests, extended family, longtime family friends, several of my mother's former coworkers from the fabric store. I'd flown in from Chicago, where I'd relocated for my consulting firm 3 years earlier, specifically to attend, despite a demanding travel schedule that week. I arrived to find my seating assignment placed at a table near the kitchen entrance, tucked alongside distant cousins I barely knew, while my siblings, Desmond and Miles, both now with completed degrees, Desmond in finance and Miles, remarkably, in pre-med, sat at the head table alongside my parents, positions of honor that felt, even before anything was said, like a physical manifestation of exactly how my mother had organized her understanding of her children's respective worth. I sat at that table by the kitchen door for the first hour of the party without saying much, watching servers move past me constantly, catching fragments of the head table's conversation whenever the swinging door briefly quieted the ambient noise. I told myself the seating chart was probably just an oversight, a logistics decision made by whoever had organized the tables, not a deliberate statement. Then my mother stood up during the toasts, glass of wine in hand, and began working her way through introductions for the benefit of guests who hadn't met all of her children before, several of her husband's cousins visiting from out of state, a handful of newer friends from her book club. "This is my son Desmond," she said warmly, gesturing toward the head table. "He's a financial analyst in Chicago, doing wonderfully. And this is Miles, currently in his 2nd year of medical school, we're so incredibly proud of him." She paused, scanning the room until her eyes landed on my table near the kitchen door. "And over there is Faith, my oldest. She's the one who didn't finish college." A few polite, uncertain laughs rippled through the nearby tables, the kind of laughter people offer when they sense something is meant to be lightly humorous but aren't entirely sure why. I felt my face go warm, the old familiar mixture of humiliation and resignation I'd absorbed at dozens of gatherings before this one. I smiled anyway, the smile I'd perfected over 15 years of these exact moments, and said nothing. What my mother didn't know, what almost nobody at that party knew, aside from my father, who'd learned it only recently through an offhand comment I'd made during a rare private conversation, was that 3 weeks earlier, my consulting firm had been featured in a regional business journal's profile on emerging entrepreneurs under 35, highlighting our recent expansion and a significant new contract with a restaurant group operating across 4 states. I'd brought a small stack of business cards with me to the party, almost as an afterthought, tucked into my clutch alongside my phone and lipstick, not with any specific plan in mind, just an old professional habit of always having them available. After my mother finished her toast and guests returned to their conversations, I waited for a natural lull, then made my way to the head table, where she was still standing, chatting with one of her book club friends. "Mom," I said, "I wanted to give you something." I handed her the business card. She looked down at it, her expression shifting slowly as she read the text printed across it: Faith Holloway, founding partner, Meridian Hospitality Consulting Group. "What is this?" She asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer might complicate the story she'd just told a room full of guests moments earlier. That's my business card, Mom. I co-founded a consulting firm 3 years ago. We currently work with restaurant groups across 4 states. Last month, we were featured in a regional business journal's profile on entrepreneurs under 35. My mother looked at the card again, then back up at me, her book club friend beside her glancing between us with poorly concealed curiosity. I don't understand, my mother said slowly. You told me you were still. She stopped, seeming to recognize, mid-sentence, that she'd never actually asked me directly what I currently did for work, that she'd simply continued assuming, for years, that waitress remained an accurate description because nothing had ever forced her to update it. I haven't waited tables in almost 11 years, Mom. I left college at 19 because Dad lost his job and Miles's treatment needed funding that our insurance wasn't covering. I never told you that directly, because you seemed so committed to a simpler story, and I didn't want to make you feel guilty about something that had already happened. But I also never told you what actually happened in the years since, because every time I tried, you'd already decided you knew the whole story without needing an update. My mother's hand, still holding the wine glass she'd carried over from her toast, trembled slightly. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the tile floor near the head table, wine splashing across the hem of her dress and several nearby guests' shoes. The room's attention, already partially drawn by our conversation, turned fully toward the sound of breaking glass. My father rushed over with napkins. Desmond and Miles both stood, uncertain what had happened. My mother stood frozen, still holding the business card, staring at me with an expression I'd genuinely never seen from her before, something between shock and the specific, uncomfortable dawning of having said something in front of 60 guests that she was only now realizing had been fundamentally, deeply wrong. Faith, she said quietly, once the immediate commotion around the broken glass had settled and a server had cleared the area, why didn't you tell me any of this before tonight? I tried, Mom, multiple times over the years. You'd redirect the conversation, or tell people I was being modest, or simply change the subject back to Desmond or Miles. Eventually I stopped trying, because it felt like nothing I said actually changed the story you'd already decided was true. My mother sat down slowly at the head table, the business card still in her hand, and I watched something shift across her face that looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like genuine reckoning rather than deflection. I need everyone to know something, she said, standing up again, her voice carrying across the now attentive room, still slightly unsteady from the shock of the broken glass. I made a mistake just now, introducing Faith. I told you she didn't finish college, and I let that define how this family has talked about her for years. What I didn't tell you, what I didn't fully understand myself until about 90 seconds ago, is that Faith left college at 19 to help this family survive a financial crisis, and that she's spent the years since building a genuinely successful consulting business that most of us apparently know nothing about. The room had gone fully quiet now, 60 guests absorbing a correction that clearly surprised nearly everyone in attendance, including, visibly, both of my brothers. The rest of the party unfolded in a kind of surreal aftermath, guests approaching me throughout the remaining hours with a curiosity that felt entirely different from anything I'd experienced at a family gathering in years. My mother's book club friend, the one who'd been standing beside her when I handed over the business card, spent nearly 15 minutes asking detailed questions about Meridian's work, genuinely interested in a way that made clear she'd absorbed my mother's correction completely. Desmond found me near the dessert table about an hour later, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of guilt and genuine surprise. Faith, I had no idea, he said. I mean, I knew you left school, obviously, but I never really understood why, and I definitely didn't know about the consulting firm. Mom always talked about it like you just gave up, I guess, and I never thought to question that. Why would you have questioned it? I said, not unkindly. You were 15 when I left. You grew up with the story Mom told, the same way everyone else at this party did. I don't blame you for believing it. I blame myself, a little, for not fighting harder to correct it sooner. What made tonight different? Why say something now, after all these years of not correcting it? I thought about that question for a moment, turning it over honestly before answering. I think I finally got tired of protecting Mom from a truth that was never actually shameful in the first place. I left college to help this family survive a crisis. That's not a failure story, Desmond. That's a sacrifice story. I just let Mom's version of events stand for years because I didn't want to make her feel guilty, and somewhere along the way, protecting her feelings became more important than correcting the record about my own life. Miles approached separately, later that evening, considerably quieter than Desmond had been, his expression carrying something closer to genuine distress. Faith, I've been thinking about this since Mom's toast. I got to finish medical school. I got to become exactly what this family always wanted one of us to become. And I think part of why I got that chance was specifically because you left school to help cover the gap in my treatment costs. I never really let myself think about that connection directly until tonight. Miles, I don't want you carrying guilt about this. I made that decision because I wanted to, because keeping this family stable mattered more to me at 19 than finishing a degree on the original timeline. You didn't take anything from me. If anything, watching you finish medical school this year has been one of the things I'm proudest of in this entire family. I still feel like I should have asked more questions over the years, he said. About what you were actually doing, about why the waitress story never quite made sense once I got old enough to actually think critically about it. My father found me alone near the parking lot as the party wound down, his expression carrying an exhaustion that seemed to extend beyond just the evening's unexpected drama. Faith, I should have corrected your mother's story years ago. I knew the truth about why you left school. I let her simplify it into something easier to explain at parties, because it felt easier than reopening the whole conversation about that period. That was a failure on my part, not just hers. I appreciate you saying that, Dad. I think, honestly, everyone in this family found it easier to just accept Mom's version rather than push back on it, myself included for a long time. I'm not trying to distribute blame at this point. I just needed, finally, for the actual story to exist in the room instead of the simplified one. My mother approached me last, as most of the remaining guests were saying their goodbyes. The earlier shock of the broken glass and public correction now settled into something quieter and more reflective. Faith, can we talk properly? Not at a party, with people listening. Just the two of us, sometime this week before you fly back to Chicago. I agreed, and we met 2 days later at a quiet coffee shop near my parents' house, away from the noise and performance of a family gathering, just the two of us working through 15 years of accumulated misunderstanding in a conversation that took nearly 3 hours to fully unfold. I need you to understand something, my mother said, early in that conversation. I think, back when you left college, I was so overwhelmed by everything happening at once, your father's job, Miles's diagnosis, the mortgage, that I couldn't fully process what you were actually sacrificing to help us. It was easier, somehow, to tell myself and everyone else that you'd simply struggled with the workload, because that story didn't require me to sit with the guilt of having a 19-year-old daughter give up her education to keep this family financially stable. I understand that instinct, I said. But Mom, that story didn't just protect you from guilt. It cost me 15 years of being introduced as a disappointment at every family gathering, while Desmond and Miles got introduced with genuine pride for paths that, frankly, existed partly because of what I gave up. I know, she said quietly. I've had 2 days to really sit with that, and I don't have a good excuse anymore. I think somewhere along the way, believing the simpler story became easier than confronting what it actually cost you, and I let that comfort matter more than actually knowing my own daughter's real life. We sat with that admission for a long moment, the coffee between us gone lukewarm, before my mother asked something I hadn't fully anticipated. Faith, I want to actually understand what you've built. Not the business card version. The real version. Would you be willing to walk me through it properly? Over the following weeks, I did something I'd never done with my mother before. I invited her into the actual substance of my career, rather than continuing to let her absorb only the surface-level corrections that had emerged at the party. I sent her the business journal profile. I walked her, over a long phone call, through Meridian's origin story, how I'd met my co-founders, Priya and Jonas, both former colleagues from my restaurant management days, how we'd identified a gap in the market for hospitality operations consulting specifically tailored to independent restaurants struggling to compete against larger chains. I explained the actual mechanics of our work, the financial audits we conducted for struggling clients, the operational restructuring plans we designed, the specific case studies where our intervention had saved businesses from closure, including one particularly meaningful project where we'd helped a family-owned diner remarkably similar to Sylvie's original establishment avoid bankruptcy through a comprehensive restructuring of their supply chain and staffing model. My mother listened to all of it with a genuine attentiveness that felt entirely new, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she was actually absorbing the details rather than simply nodding politely until she could redirect to something more comfortable. I had no idea any of this required this level of financial expertise, she admitted, during one of these calls. I think I'd genuinely convinced myself, over the years, that hospitality meant something closer to what you were doing at 19, rather than understanding it as an entire field of business strategy. 3 months after that birthday party, my mother visited me in Chicago for the first time in over 6 years, a trip she'd never previously prioritized despite my repeated invitations over the preceding decade. I gave her an actual tour of Meridian's offices, introduced her to Priya and Jonas, let her sit in on a portion of a client strategy meeting where she watched, firsthand, the kind of detailed financial and operational analysis that constituted my actual daily work. I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said at the party, she told me, during dinner that evening, in a restaurant I'd chosen specifically because Meridian had consulted on its recent operational turnaround. I spent 15 years telling a story about you that was not only inaccurate, but actively cruel, without ever bothering to update it based on actual evidence available to me the entire time. I think the real failure wasn't just that first mistaken story back when you were 19. It was that I never once, in 15 years, asked you a genuine, curious question about what your actual life looked like, because I'd already decided I knew the answer. I appreciate you saying that clearly, I told her. I think what hurt most, over the years, wasn't really the initial misunderstanding about why I left school. It was watching you ask genuine, detailed questions about Desmond's job, about Miles's medical school applications, while treating my entire adult life as a settled, an interesting story that didn't warrant further investigation. I understand that now, she said. I don't think I can fully undo 15 years of that pattern in a single dinner. But I want you to know I intend to keep asking real questions from here forward, not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because I genuinely want to understand the actual person you've become, rather than the outdated story I let define you for so long. Desmond and Miles, in the months following that birthday party, both made similar efforts to rebuild a more accurate understanding of my life, Desmond asking detailed questions about Meridian's client acquisition strategy during a visit to Chicago that spring, Miles, once his medical school schedule allowed, spending an entire weekend genuinely curious about the operational side of restaurant consulting in a way that felt like real sibling interest rather than obligatory family catch-up. The following year, at what would have been my mother's 61st birthday, the family gathering felt entirely different from the one that had preceded it. My mother's toast that year included, unprompted, an accurate and detailed description of Meridian's recent expansion into a fifth state, alongside genuine updates about Desmond's promotion and Miles's residency placement, all three of her children's accomplishments discussed with equal curiosity and pride for what felt like the first time in 15 years. I sat, that year, not near the kitchen door, but at the head table alongside my brothers, listening to my mother describe all three of our lives with an accuracy and warmth that I'd genuinely stopped believing I'd ever hear directed at my own path. 2 years have passed since that 60th birthday party where a wine glass shattered on tile and, along with it, 15 years of an inaccurate story about who I actually was. Meridian Hospitality Consulting has since expanded into a sixth state, and last year, we were approached by a much larger hospitality investment firm interested in a potential partnership that would allow us to scale our operational consulting model into a broader turnaround fund for struggling independent restaurants nationally. My mother knows all of this now in genuine, current detail, not because I've made a point of proving anything to her, but because she asks, regularly, with a curiosity that has become entirely normal between us rather than the notable exception it once was. I got married last fall, to a man named Elias I'd been with for 4 years, a fellow entrepreneur who'd witnessed, over the course of our relationship, the entire arc of my family's slow recalibration and had commented, more than once, on how meaningful it was to watch a 15-year-old wound finally begin to heal in real time. My mother gave a toast at that wedding that I still think about often, standing in front of family and friends who'd known me at every stage of the story, the 19-year-old who left college, the diner waitress, the operations manager, and finally, the consulting firm partner standing in a wedding dress that evening. I told a story about my daughter for 15 years that wasn't true, she said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the admission. I called her the one who didn't finish college, as though that single fact defined everything about who she was. What I've learned since is that Faith didn't fail at anything. She made an extraordinary sacrifice at 19 to help this family survive one of the hardest periods of our lives, and then she built something remarkable in the years since, entirely on her own terms, without ever once asking this family to properly acknowledge what that sacrifice actually cost her. I'm not proud of how long it took me to see that clearly. I am, without reservation, enormously proud of the daughter I finally took the time to actually know. I cried during that toast, not from the old, familiar humiliation I'd absorbed at gatherings for 15 years, but from the specific relief of finally hearing my own mother articulate, publicly, completely, exactly what I'd built and exactly what it had cost me, a relief I hadn't fully realized I was still waiting for until it finally arrived. Miles, now in his final year of residency, mentioned during a recent visit that he'd started telling his own colleagues about Meridian's work, using it, unprompted, as an example when discussing healthcare administration and operational efficiency parallels between hospitals and restaurants. I used to just say my sister was in the restaurant business, he told me. Now I actually explain what that means, because I finally understand it well enough to explain it properly myself. I think, often, about the version of that birthday party where I might have simply absorbed my mother's introduction the way I'd absorbed dozens of similar moments before it, smiling, staying quiet, letting the comfortable, familiar story stand uncorrected for another year, another decade, protecting her from a guilt she'd spent 15 years avoiding at the cost of my own accurate history. What actually happened instead, the business card, the shattered glass, the uncomfortable public correction, and the years of genuine rebuilding that followed it, required a kind of quiet courage I hadn't fully recognized in myself until I was standing in front of 60 guests, watching my mother's hand tremble around a wine glass that could no longer hold the weight of a story that had simply, finally, stopped being true.